Billionaire family secrets usually stay behind closed doors, but what happened at this public dump site changed everything. A 19-year-old scavenger was looking for discarded scrap metal when he found something that didn't belong in the trash. It wasn't money. It was a dark red scarf belonging to someone who was supposed to be missing. He didn't know it yet, but this simple discovery was about to expose a terrifying betrayal inside a wealthy estate. A desperate son was spending millions to find his mother, completely unaware that the real monster was sleeping in his own house, laughing in silence. How far would you go to protect the ones you love? Before we reveal the shocking truth, drop a comment below and let me know which city or country you are watching from. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next of this insane story. The morning sun over the city of New York did not bring warmth to everyone. For Brian, a 19-year-old black teenager, the dawn simply meant it was time to start walking. He wore a faded gray hoodie that was 2 sizes too big, and sneakers with soles so worn he could feel every pebble on the pavement. Brian lived in a small, damp basement apartment in the outer suburbs, a place he shared with nothing but his own thoughts. He did not have a family, a college degree, or a steady job. What he did have was a heavy canvas sack across his shoulder and a sharp eye for things that other people threw away. Every single day, Brian walked for miles toward the industrial district. His daily destination was a massive, fenced-in, public dump site where the city's waste accumulated in giant mounds. To most people, this place was a landscape of filth and unwanted odors. To Brian, it was his only source of survival. He spent hours sorting through plastic bottles, discarded aluminum cans, and pieces of scrap metal. He sold these items to a local recycling yard for a few dollars, just enough to buy a loaf of bread and a carton of milk. Despite his difficult circumstances, Brian was not bitter. He possessed a quiet dignity and a remarkably sharp memory. He noticed the smallest details around him: the brand of a discarded shoe, the color of a passing car, and the faces of the strangers he passed on the street. He believed that even in the trash, everything had a story. Meanwhile, on the wealthy side of the city, a completely different reality unfolded. Morrow, a 37-year-old billionaire known for his immense real estate empire, stood on the sidewalk of a bustling downtown street. He did not look like a powerful businessman today. His expensive, tailored suit was wrinkled, his hair was messy, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. Morrow was a deeply kind and humble man who had never forgotten his humble beginnings. Right now, his vast wealth meant absolutely nothing to him. His heart was completely broken because his elderly mother, Martha, who suffered from severe dementia, had vanished from their estate 3 days ago. With trembling hands, Morrow held a thick stack of paper flyers. He did not leave this task to his assistants. He wanted to do it himself. Morrow walked up to a cold metal lamppost and used heavy tape to secure a flyer to the surface. The paper displayed a clear photograph of a sweet-faced 60-year-old woman with gray hair and a gentle smile. Below the photograph, bold black letters carried a desperate message: missing. A reward of $500,000 was promised to anyone who could provide information leading to her safe return. Wave. Feeling at his mother's face on the paper, feeling a wave of intense grief, he prayed that someone, anywhere in this vast city, would look at the flyer, recognize her, and help him bring her back home. 2 completely different worlds existed in the same city, separated by wealth, but connected by the unpredictable hands of fate. The next morning, the illusion of a perfect life continued at Morrow's grand estate. In the spacious living room, Viona, Morrow's 31-year-old wife, sat on a velvet sofa. She held a silk handkerchief to her eyes, sobbing softly as Morrow walked into the room. To anyone watching, she looked like a deeply grieving daughter-in-law who was desperate for Martha's return. She reached out and touched Morrow's arm, her voice shaking with emotion as she told him that she had spent the entire night praying for his mother's safety. Morrow hugged her tightly, feeling grateful for her support. He truly believed his wife was just as heartbroken as he was. Viona then insisted on helping him distribute more flyers around the city streets, a gesture that made Morrow admire her even more. However, beneath her tears, Viona's mind was perfectly calm and calculating. She did not want Martha to come back. Once Morrow left the room to make another phone call to the police, Viona's sad expression instantly vanished. She checked her reflection in the large wall mirror, adjusted her expensive diamond earrings, and smiled coldly. Everything was going according to her hidden plan. Later that afternoon, Fiona drove her luxury black sedan out of the estate. Instead of going to the busy downtown area to hand out flyers, she drove toward the quiet, industrial edge of the city. She stopped near the entrance of the massive public dump site, opened her car window, and casually tossed a large, taped cardboard box into a nearby bin before speeding away. At that exact moment, Brian was working a few yards away, his hands covered in dirt as he sorted through a pile of plastic. The loud sound of the luxury car's engine caught his attention. He looked up just in time to see the shiny black sedan drive away, leaving a cloud of dust behind. Brian found it very strange for such an expensive vehicle to visit this filthy area. Curious, he walked over to the bin and pulled out the heavy cardboard box. It was completely empty, except for one single item left at the very bottom. Brian reached inside and pulled out a beautiful, thick, hand-woven dark red scarf. It was made of high-quality wool, completely clean and clearly expensive. It did not belong in a trash bin. Brian examined the scarf. He noticed a tiny white cloth label sewn neatly into the inner corner, but he did not read it closely yet. What caught his attention was how out of place it felt. Why would someone driving a luxury car come all the way here just to throw away an empty box and a perfectly good scarf? He felt a strange sensation in his chest, an intuitive feeling that something was deeply wrong with this picture. He folded the dark red scarf carefully and placed it inside his canvas sack, deciding to keep it. The daily routine of the city seemed to continue as usual, but the small, quiet actions of that afternoon had already set a dangerous chain of events into motion. The following morning, Brian walked his usual route toward the commercial district to sell his collected cans. As he crossed a busy intersection near a local bus stop, a bright white paper taped to a green lamppost caught his eye. He stepped closer and stared at the large, bold letters that read "Missing." Beneath the text was a clear photograph of an elderly woman with a gentle smile. Brian froze. His eyes darted from the woman's face down to the description written at the bottom of the page. The flyer stated that 60-year-old Martha was last seen wearing a distinctive, hand-woven dark red scarf. Brian's heart began to race. He quickly reached into his canvas sack and pulled out the thick wool scarf he had rescued from the trash bin just 24 hours ago. He compared the deep crimson color of the fabric to the details listed on the paper. It was an exact match. Brian realized with absolute certainty that the empty box dropped by the luxury black sedan was directly connected to this missing billionaire's mother. A sudden, chilling thought struck his mind. If the expensive car had thrown away her personal belongings at the public dump site, then Martha herself must be somewhere near that desolate area. Without wasting a single second, Brian turned around and ran as fast as his worn-out sneakers could carry him. He ignored the burning pain in his lungs as he sprinted back toward the industrial edge of the city. He kept picturing the fragile elderly woman, lost and confused in a place filled with filth and heavy machinery. When he finally reached the massive iron gates of the public dump site, he skidded to a halt. His eyes widened in shock. The familiar open entrance was completely blocked. A brand-new metal chain with a heavy padlock secured the gates, and two large security guards in matching black uniforms stood outside. Brian approached the gates, his voice breathless, as he tried to explain that an old woman might be inside and needed immediate help. However, the guards did not care about the words of a poor, dirty teenager. They stepped forward aggressively, placed their hands on their belts, and told Brian to leave the property immediately. They informed him that a private company had just leased the entire dump site for a special project, and that absolutely no civilians, especially scavengers, were allowed near the perimeter. Brian backed away, his mind spinning with fear. He noticed a small logo on the guards' uniforms that matched the name of a private security firm. Someone with an immense amount of money had deliberately locked down the area right after the scarf was dropped. Brian stood on the dusty road outside the fence, realizing that he was the only person in the entire city who knew the terrifying truth, but he was completely powerless to get inside. A wave of intense panic washed over him, making it hard to breathe. His hands shook violently as he gripped the straps of his heavy canvas sack. He felt an overwhelming mix of fear, anger, and deep sadness. An innocent, elderly woman suffering from dementia was trapped somewhere inside that massive, desolate wasteland, and the people who were supposed to protect the area were treating him like a criminal just for trying to help. He felt a crushing weight of helplessness, knowing that his poverty made him invisible to the world. He walked away from the locked gates, his mind spinning with desperate thoughts. He knew he could not just sit in his basement apartment and do nothing. If he stayed quiet, Martha might not survive the night. He pulled the missing flyer from his pocket, staring at the face of the billionaire Morrow, whose contact information was printed at the bottom. Brian decided to take a massive risk. He walked for nearly 2 hours, leaving the dirty industrial district behind and entering the wealthiest neighborhood in the city. The houses here looked like castles, surrounded by tall brick walls and perfectly manicured green lawns. Finally, Brian found the address listed on the flyer. It was a spectacular estate with giant black iron gates and a security booth at the entrance. Brian approached the gate, his heart pounding against his ribs. He could feel his face burning with embarrassment as he looked down at his dirty hoodie and torn sneakers, which stood out horribly against the luxury of the neighborhood. He knocked on the glass window of the security booth. A guard in a crisp uniform looked at Brian with instant suspicion and rolled the window down just 2 inches. Brian tried to speak quickly, his voice cracking with emotion. He explained that he had crucial information about Martha and that he needed to speak to Morrow immediately. But before he could even finish his sentence, the heavy front door of the mansion opened. Fiona walked out onto the marble porch, holding a cup of tea. She noticed the commotion at the gate and walked down the stone path. When she saw Brian's disheveled appearance, a look of intense disgust crossed her face. Brian tried to call out to her, mentioning the dark red scarf, but Fiona's eyes turned incredibly cold. She instantly cut him off, speaking to the guard in a sharp, loud voice. She told the guard that Brian was just another homeless scammer trying to take advantage of her husband's grief for money. She ordered the guard to remove Brian from the property immediately and threatened to call the police if he ever showed his face near their home again. The guard grabbed Brian's shoulder and shoved him away from the gate. Brian stumbled backward onto the concrete sidewalk, tears of frustration stinging his eyes as Fiona turned around and walked back into her mansion with a victorious smile. He wiped his face with the sleeve of his faded hoodie, feeling completely defeated. He turned away from the massive iron gates and began the long, humiliating walk back to his neighborhood. Every step felt heavier than the last. He had tried to do the right thing, but his poverty had made his voice completely worthless in the eyes of the wealthy. Just as he reached the end of the long residential block, the loud screech of car tires echoed behind him. Brian turned around and saw a large luxury SUV pull out of the mansion's driveway, accelerating quickly down the street. However, instead of driving past him, the vehicle suddenly slowed down and pulled over right next to the sidewalk where Brian was walking. The tinted passenger window rolled down smoothly, revealing the driver. It was Morrow. The 37-year-old billionaire looked completely exhausted. His shirt collar was unbuttoned, his hair was disheveled, and his hands gripped the steering wheel with desperation. He had left the house to clear his head, unable to handle the suffocating grief inside. Morrow looked at Brian's distressed face and the canvas sack on his shoulder. He had seen the teenager being shoved away from his gate through the window of his study, and a sudden wave of intuition told him not to let this boy go. Before Morrow could even speak, Brian took a deep breath, stepped closer to the vehicle, and gathered all the courage left in his body. He pointed back toward the mansion and shouted at the top of his lungs, "Your mom is alive. I saw her in the trash." The words cut through the quiet neighborhood like a knife. Morrow froze, his eyes widening in complete shock. Any other wealthy man might have laughed or driven away, but Morrow was a kind-hearted person who was desperate for any real clue. He saw the raw sincerity and the desperate tears in Brian's eyes. This was not the look of a scammer. It was the look of someone who knew a terrifying secret. Morrow immediately unlocked the passenger door and told Brian to get inside. As Brian sat on the expensive leather seat, still holding his dirty canvas sack, Morrow demanded to know exactly what he meant. Brian quickly explained everything. He told Morrow about the luxury black sedan that had dropped the empty box at the public dump site, the beautiful dark red scarf he had found inside it, and how the entire area had been locked down by private security guards immediately afterward. To prove his story, Brian opened his sack and pulled out the hand-woven dark red scarf. When Morrow saw the fabric, his breath hitched. He snatched the scarf from Brian's hands, his eyes filling with tears as he recognized his mother's favorite garment. Just as Brian was about to explain more, the phone in Morrow's dashboard began to ring loudly. The caller ID showed Viona's name. Morrow answered it on the speakerphone, his voice tense. On the other end, Viona's voice sounded panicked, asking where he had gone so suddenly. Morrow told her that he was with the boy from the gate and that they were driving to the public dump site right now to find his mother. There was a sudden, sharp silence on the line before Viona frantically tried to convince him to stop, claiming it was a trap. But Morrow hung up the phone, stepped on the gas pedal and drove toward the industrial district, giving Brian a glimmer of hope that the truth would finally be revealed. The luxury SUV tore through the city streets, moving at high speed until it reached the dusty outer edge of the industrial zone. When the vehicle pulled up to the massive iron gates of the public dump site, Morrow did not hesitate. He stepped out of the car with authority, with Brian following closely behind. The two security guards in black uniforms immediately stepped forward to block their path. But when they recognized Morrow, Billionaire, whose face was frequently on the news, their aggressive expressions quickly turned to fear. Morrow demanded that they open the gates instantly, and without a word, one of the guards unlocked the heavy padlock. Morrow and Brian rushed into the desolate wasteland. The area was enormous, filled with towering mounds of garbage, rusted machinery, and plastic debris. Brian led Morrow directly to the specific section near the bins where he had found the box. "She was somewhere around here," Brian said, his eyes scanning the landscape frantically. But as they looked around, the area was completely empty. There was no sign of the elderly woman. Brian ran up the smaller mounds, calling out Martha's name, but the only response was the whistling of the wind through the trash. Morrow's hopeful expression began to fade into deep confusion and disappointment. Before Brian could search any further, the loud sound of a car engine roared behind them. A white police cruiser pulled into the dump site, followed closely by Viona's luxury black sedan. The car doors slammed shut, and Viona ran toward Morrow, her face pale and her eyes filled with tears. Two police officers stepped out of the cruiser with their hands on their holsters. Viona immediately grabbed Morrow's arm, crying out that she had been terrified for his safety. She pointed a shaking finger at Brian and told the officers that Brian was a dangerous liar who had lured her husband to this abandoned place to extort money from them. The police officers stepped toward Brian, demanding that he put his hands on his head. Brian backed away, his voice shaking as he tried to defend himself. He told the officers that he was telling the truth and that the scarf was proof. However, Viona quickly stepped in, her voice sharp and manipulative. She told the officers that the dark red scarf had actually been stolen from their mansion days ago, and she accused Brian of being the thief who took it. She argued that a poor scavenger would do anything for a $500,000 reward, including fabricating a cruel story about a missing elderly woman. The officers looked at Brian's dirty clothes, and then at Viona's expensive attire, instantly making up their minds. One of the officers pulled out a pair of metal handcuffs and told Brian that he was under arrest for trespassing, attempted extortion, and theft. Brian looked at Morrow, his eyes begging for help, but Morrow stood completely still. The billionaire looked utterly crushed, holding the red scarf tightly in his hands, while staring at the empty, filthy ground. Morrow felt a deep sense of betrayal, believing that Brian had indeed used his mother's missing clothing to play a cruel trick on his grief. The situation had spun completely out of control, and the walls of the trap were closing in on Brian. The cold steel of the handcuffs clicked loudly around his wrists, biting into his skin. He did not fight back, but his entire body trembled with frustration and grief. He looked at Morrow one last time, trying to find a single spark of trust in the billionaire's eyes. But Morrow simply turned his head away, staring at the ground in silent, bitter disappointment. Viona stood beside her husband, her face buried against his shoulder as she pretended to cry, but over Morrow's back she shot Brian a look of pure, malicious triumph. The police officers shoved Brian into the cramped, hot back seat of the cruiser. As the car drove away from the dump site, Brian watched his familiar landscape disappear through the wire mesh window. He spent the next several hours in a cold, dimly lit holding cell at the local precinct. He sat on a hard wooden bench, his head in his hands. He felt completely broken, had no money for a lawyer, no family to bail him out, and no way to prove his innocence. The system saw him exactly how Viona wanted them to see him, a desperate, poor teenager who tried to use a rich man's tragedy for a quick payday. He felt a crushing sense of guilt, not for himself, but for Martha. The poor woman was still out there somewhere, helpless and cold, and the only person who cared about her was locked behind iron bars. Late that evening, a guard unlocked the cell door. To Brian's surprise, he was told that he was free to go. The precinct captain explained that Morrow had refused to press formal criminal charges against him. Morrow was too kind-hearted to ruin a young man's life, even if he believed that young man had lied to him. However, the police gave Brian a harsh final warning. If he ever went near Morrow, Fiona, or their property again, he would go straight to a maximum security prison for a very long time. Brian walked out of the police station into the freezing night air. He had no money for a bus, so he had to walk 4 miles back to his neighborhood. When he finally reached his small, damp basement apartment, the room felt emptier and colder than ever before. He had lost his canvas sack, his dignity, and his only way to earn a living since the dump site was now locked down. He collapsed onto his thin mattress without eating a single bite of food. He stared blankly at the cracked ceiling as the hours ticked away toward midnight. He felt completely invisible, defeated by the immense power of wealth and lies. All his hopes for a better life were entirely gone, and the dark reality of his poverty settled over him like a heavy blanket. He closed his eyes, wishing he could forget the entire ordeal, believing that the truth had lost and that Fiona had won a permanent victory, but sleep did not come to Brian that night. Every time he drifted off, he pictured the gentle smile of Martha on the missing flyer. Contrasting sharply with the cold, triumphant eyes of Fiona at the dump site, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something vital. Unable to rest, Brian sat up on his mattress and looked at his small wooden table. The corner of the room sat his extra jacket. He remembered that before the police arrested him, he had pulled a small piece of fabric from the dark red scarf and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Brian walked over, pulled out the piece of fabric, and turned on his dim desk lamp. Oh. It was the tiny white cloth label that was sewn neatly into the inner corner of the scarf. He had been so rushed before that he hadn't examined it closely. Now, under the light, he noticed that the label was not from a clothing brand at all. It bore the printed name of a high-end, private medical facility located 60 miles outside the city, Silver Pine Sanitarium. Below the name, written in faded, permanent black ink, was a serial number and the handwritten initials, MV. Brian sat back in shock. Martha's initials were MV Martha Vance. This scarf was a specialized piece of clothing provided to long-term residents of a highly private psychiatric facility. Suddenly, the pieces of the puzzle began to move in his mind. If Martha was a wealthy woman living in Morrow's estate, why did she have a garment from a hidden, faraway sanitarium? And why would Fiona go through the trouble of driving all the way to the public dump site just to throw away an empty box in this specific scarf? Brian realized he was facing a massive, dangerous choice. He could follow the police warnings, stay in his basement, and protect his own safety. If he stayed quiet, no one would ever bother him again, but an innocent woman would remain trapped in a dark place forever. On the other hand, if he tried to contact Morrow again, he risked going straight to prison for violating his warning. He had no car, no money, and no authority, but he had a sharp mind and a conscience that refused to let him remain silent. He stood up, his jaw tightening with determination. He decided he would not let fear control him. Couldn't travel 60 miles to the sanitarium on foot, but he knew he had to get this physical evidence to Morrow directly. Away from the watchful eyes of Fiona, Brian waited until the clock struck 3 in the morning, the darkest hour of the night. He dressed in his darkest clothes and left his basement apartment. He walked through the shadows of the empty streets, avoiding the main roads where police cruisers might see him. He arrived at the wealthy neighborhood as the morning mist began to rise. He crept silently toward the rear perimeter of Morrow's massive estate, where a tall brick wall bordered a quiet public alleyway. Brian looked up at the high wall. He knew that climbing it was a massive crime, a direct ticket to a prison cell if he was caught, but his heart was set. He grabbed the edge of a sturdy tree branch near the wall, hauled his body upward, prepared to make a move that would change the course of everyone's lives forever. Brian dropped silently onto the damp grass inside the estate, keeping his body low to the ground. He crept toward the large glass windows of Morrow's private study, where a light was already burning. Through the glass, he saw Morrow sitting alone at his desk, his head buried in his hands, completely exhausted. Brian took a deep breath and knocked firmly on the glass window pane. Morrow jumped up in surprise, his eyes widening when he saw Brian standing in the shadows outside. Before Morrow could call for security, Brian held the tiny white cloth label firmly against the glass. Pointing directly to the printed text, Silver Pine Sanitarium, and the handwritten initials MV, Morrow froze. He walked over, unlocked the glass doors, and pulled Brian inside, demanding an explanation. Brian placed the label on the desk and explained that this tag was hidden inside the dark red scarf that Fiona had thrown away. He begged Morrow to call the sanitarium right now to check their records. Morrow's hands shook as he dialed the number for Silver Pine Sanitarium. He used his authority as a powerful billionaire to bypass the receptionist and speak directly to the head administrator. He demanded to know if a woman named Martha Vance had been admitted to their facility. The administrator's answer shattered Morrow's world completely. The readers might assume that Fiona had simply dumped Martha at the trash site because she was tired of caring for an elderly woman with dementia, and then moved her to a faraway private sanitarium to keep her hidden. But the truth was far more sinister. The administrator revealed that a woman fitting Martha's exact description had indeed been admitted 3 days ago under a completely false name, using a private medical insurance account funded secretly by Fiona. More shockingly, the facility's recent medical evaluation showed that Martha did not suffer from natural, permanent dementia at all. It turned out that for the past 6 months, Fiona had been secretly slipping heavy doses of advanced sedatives and memory-blocking drugs into Martha's daily tea. She did this to make Martha appear completely insane so Morrow would believe his mother had wandered off on her own. Fiona's ultimate goal was to eliminate Martha entirely, gain full control over Morrow's massive wealth, and ensure there was no one left to question her spending. The afternoon she drove to the dump site, Fiona had actually forced Martha into the back of her luxury black sedan, driven her to the industrial district, and handed her over to a corrupt medical transport team she had hired to take the elderly woman to the sanitarium forever. Fiona had casually tossed the empty box and Martha's favorite scarf into the bin, assuming a poor scavenger would never understand their meaning. This entire horrific scheme worked exactly because, from the very beginning, Martha had realized what her daughter-in-law was doing. Even through her drug-induced confusion, Martha had hidden the white medical label inside her favorite red scarf weeks ago. She purposely dropped the scarf inside the empty box when Fiona wasn't looking, knowing that an honest, observant person like Brian would eventually find it at the dump site and use it to reveal the truth. Just as the phone call ended, the study doors swung open, and Fiona walked in holding a fresh cup of tea for her husband. When she saw Brian standing next to Morrow, she instantly dropped the cup, the porcelain shattering loudly on the hardwood floor. Morrow stood up slowly, his eyes filled with absolute fury and profound disgust. He held up the phone, which was still playing the administrator's recorded statement, and told Fiona that the police were already on their way to arrest her for elder abuse, poisoning, and fraud. Fiona collapsed to her knees, weeping hysterically, realizing that her elaborate web of lies had completely fallen apart because of a single, observant teenager she had tried so hard to ignore. Within 20 minutes, the quiet morning air of the estate was filled with the flashing blue lights and loud sirens of police cruisers. The officers who had arrested Brian the night before were now the ones placing heavy iron handcuffs on Fiona's wrists. She hid her face from the cameras as they led her away to a waiting police car, facing charges that would ensure she spent many decades behind bars. Morrow did not waste a single second after his wife's arrest. He immediately ordered his private security team and medical staff to accompany him and Brian to Silver Pine Sanitarium. When they arrived at the facility, Morrow rushed into the private room and found his mother sitting by a window, looking pale and confused. Under the care of independent doctors, Martha was immediately taken off the dangerous sedatives Fiona had been secretly giving her. Within a few weeks, the heavy fog in her mind completely cleared. Her memory returned, her strength came back, and she was finally able to smile her gentle, warm smile once again. Morrow's deep gratitude toward Brian was immeasurable. He knew that without the 19-year-old's honesty, courage, and sharp memory, his mother would have remained trapped and drugged in that facility forever.
Ow.
Morrow held a private meeting with Brian in his study. He told Brian that he would no longer have to carry a heavy canvas sack through the dusty streets, or search through piles of waste just to survive. Morrow fully funded Brian's education, allowing him to enroll in a prestigious university to study business and social science. Furthermore, Morrow appointed Brian as the chief manager of a brand new charitable foundation created in Martha's honor, a foundation dedicated to helping homeless teenagers and vulnerable elderly citizens across the city. A year later, Brian stood on the stage of a beautifully decorated community center, wearing a sharp, clean suit that fit him perfectly. He looked out at the audience, where Morrow and a completely healthy Martha sat in the front row, smiling proudly at him. Brian was no longer the invisible, quiet boy from the damp basement apartment. He had used his sharp eye for detail to build a life focused on lifting others out of the darkness of poverty. As he closed his speech to the large crowd, Brian shared a profound truth that he had learned from his difficult journey. He reminded everyone that a person's true value is never determined by the amount of money in their bank account or the clothes on their back. True wealth lies in a person's integrity, their willingness to stand up for justice, and their compassion for those who cannot defend themselves. He reminded the audience that the world often throws away precious things and labels them as garbage. But if you look closely enough with a kind heart, you can find the greatest treasures of truth and humanity hidden in the most unexpected places.